So I recently listened to the Ezra Klein Coates debate on his podcast because there had been so many reference to it on TikTok, and so that led me to listening to the original podcast. And I have to say the debate really clarified some of my own thinking about some topics that are tangentially related to some of the things that they raised. Because in my own thinking in the dialogue, although the common consensus was that Klein was wiped by Coates, I have to tell you he wasn't. But he both of them stimulated a lot of my own thoughts that I want to share with you. I'm a Reconstructionist renewal Jew, and just for those, and I'm also a clinical neuropsychologist and a clinical psychologist, and the concept that I want to really address a lot about is the Yetzer HaTov, the tendency towards the good, and the Yetzer Hara, the tendency towards the bad, that Jewish mysticism and Judaism in general believe is the mental construction of every human being. At our core, in our souls, we have this tendency towards the good and a tendency towards the dark. And that whenever we make a decision, one or the other is paramount. And both are necessary. And in another video, I told about the midrash of the story that the rabbis in Poland had once supposedly complained and prayed to God that there was too much adultery going on, and would God please remove the tendency to the dark, the Yetzer Hara from the populace, and God did. And the next morning, everyone gets up and no one gets out of bed. And it illustrates the point that the reason it's not called the tendency to evil, it's called the tendency to dark, is that's libido. It's animal instincts for survival. It's creativeness, including sexual energy. It's where our energy comes from. And the Yetzer HaTov is the moral sense, the value sense that needs to guide that. The tendency towards the good is, if you want to think of it as superego controlling id and ego, if you like Freudian terms better, that's fine. But I like to use the binary shorthand of Yetzer Hara, the tendency to the dark, and Yetzer HaTov, the tendency to the good. Because the notion, again, is the mission of life of human beings is to repair the world. And what that means is if everything contains a spark of the divine, particularly humanity, then your task is to raise the sparks of divinity. And you can only do that by allowing your Yetzer Hara, your dark side, to be guided by your good side in the decisions and actions that you take. So why didn't I consider that Klein wasn't wiped out? Well, it concerned when he began talking about how he viewed himself as a journalist, and then started talking about most journalists being Democrats who thought about how we would win elections. And because they want their values, which they consider, their Yetzer HaTov, which they consider to be the best, to be paramount. And suddenly I had this flash about why Republicans have always been talking about the bias of the press towards Democrats, towards liberals and progressives, when if you actually look at the content of interviews, it's veered in the other side factually, in that conservatives get better press than liberals tend to. And that's repeated studies have shown that. But that fact misses the point. You see, they're not saying that the bias is by numbers. They're saying that most of the reporters are trying to shove their values down a Republican's throat, and that the Republicans, it's not a statistical bias. I have paper because I tend to wander even more if I don't have paper to make my points. It's not the point. Republicans are complaining that they aren't allowed to speak their Yetzer Hara, which they think of as, or at least their feelings, and they're voicing the Yetzer Hara. And the important thing here to know is doesn't just, those feelings don't just belong to and represent Republicans. They're all our feelings. We all have a Yetzer Hara. We have exactly the same feelings. We are, in our core, partially all familiar with racism, sexism, intolerance towards religion, homophobic and transphobic. We know what that feels like. We know we can identify that because we have those feelings. And to the extent that you either try to suppress them or guide them with your Yetzer HaTov, your morality, your value of, I think all human beings should be treated with dignity and respect, the way Coates had phrased it, which is wonderful. But to deny that you have those feelings, that's essentially what's going on. That Democrats project their Yetzer Hara onto Republicans and in general, and MAGA specifically. It's their own shadow. They make MAGA other. They make Republicans other, so that we as Democrats don't have to own it. Our own Yetzer Hara, our own dark side. They are the racists, the homophobes, the transphobics, the religious intolerance, the supremacists, instead of their Yetzer HaTov, their tendency for good, their value system that reflects the better side of their nature needs to be strengthened. It's a balance or proportion if you contain both. And by the way, just as a sideline, because I'm not going to follow all my notes, males and females both have testosterone and estrogen. It's just that in females, estrogen is a higher balance than testosterone until menopause, and vice versa. In males, the testosterone is higher than estrogen throughout their lives, and that in part is responsible when menopause comes along and estrogen levels drop and the balance changes somewhat. Post-menopause, women get what's called postmenopausal zest. They start entering into a new career and starting a new business, and they have energy, and men don't get that. They have the same. Anyway, that's just sort of a side. That we are a balance in not only our mental state, but our physiological, hormonal state, and probably sexual state as well, and our gender state. But I don't want to go there. That's another whole discussion. So Hillary Clinton's comment about the basket of deplorables was brought up and discussed by both of them. And Coates... Klein said, "What would you make of that statement?" when she said it. And Coates said, "I wouldn't have said it," which I thought was a very interesting thing. He didn't say, "I don't agree with her," or "I didn't think it." He said, "I wouldn't have said it." And that's what made it correct, because what Hillary Clinton was doing was othering. When she said, there's a portion of Trump's base, a portion of MAGA that are transphobic, racist, sexist, and homophobic. She fueled the fire. And the issue, folks, is you're not having a debate with MAGA. The issue is you're having a debate with yourself. Right? That's the core of this current crisis. We are all in our Yetzer Hara, our tendency to the dark. We all have moments and actual feelings and thoughts and behaviors that are moments of racism and homophobia and transphobia, and we're sexist and we're religiously intolerant. You aren't perfect all the time. Got news for you folks. And when we're challenged, when we're expressing our Yetzer Hara and we're challenged, we get enraged. That is the human condition. It's not something specific to Republicans, MAGA, and not Democrats. So I'm a neuropsychologist and a clinical psychologist, and there are two things that I want you to know about in therapy because I want to blend them into this argument. And the first is a study that was done by Carl Rogers, and it's one of the classics. And what he did was there are different branches of types of therapy, and he studied beginning therapists and videotaped what they do with a client, a patient, and therapists who'd been out 10 years, 10 experienced therapists, and he videotaped them, and they covered the same branches of cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy, dynamic therapy, couples therapy. He balanced the different types. And what he discovered is for new therapists, they had their own theoretical framework. What they did very different things with their patients. The sessions looked very different in terms of technique and what was happening. By the time you looked at the 10-year group, the experienced therapists, on the videotape, they were all doing the same things with their patients, but they still described it. They stuck with their branch or their theoretical orientation. So if you were a cognitive behaviorist, you did something similar to what a psychodynamic couples therapist, Gestalt therapist, but all of the experienced therapists were doing the same thing, but they described it differently in terms of, and they kept their orientations. Why is the study important? Because people don't change their beliefs; they change their behavior, and sometimes they're not even aware of it. Because the more interesting question, why didn't they change their cognitive infrastructure? That wasn't asked, but that's a different question. But those two studies, that study is really important. That you can not change people's infrastructure, cognitive formulation, but you can change their behavior very, very clearly. And often they're not even aware of it, but they will change. The second thing is in therapy, talking about those experienced therapists, when do people change? When are they successful with patients or clients, whatever you want to call them? And I have to tell you, my own experience as a pretty good therapist over the years, and someone who's actually developed a form of psychotherapy for cognitive therapy, rehab therapy for people with mild cognitive disorder called crater therapy, but that's not what I want to talk about. When are those moments of change that occur in therapy? And I can tell you very specifically when they are. It's when a therapist makes a mistake. That's the first condition. You either misunderstand something, or you get angry, or you get pretentious, or you're not listening or hearing, or you're not connected, you're not authentic in some way. Whatever the mistake is, you make a mistake, and it happens. The second thing is you have to own up to the mistake. You watch your patient and suddenly realize what you've been doing, or the next session you've had a chance to think about it, and you come in, you own up to it, you apologize publicly to the patient, and you basically say, I'll try to do better because you were right and I was wrong, and I hurt you when I was wrong. It is very, very, very hard to do as a therapist because there's an unequal power base in the therapeutic situation. And this suddenly reverses that. It's very, very hard to do. But when you are vulnerable like that, and it's not just words, the other person gets it. They're connected. They get that you're authentic and real. In that moment, a space appears, and that person is capable of transforming themselves. That's really crucially important. Therapists don't heal patients. Therapists provide a space and the right conditions under which patients heal themselves. Anyway, I think that point that the person transforms themselves, along with Carl Rogers' study that people don't give up their infrastructure, their belief system, they change their behavior and somehow fit it into their cognitive structure so that it fits the value system, fits the behavior. Those two therapy sort of facts, or those aspects of clinical life, converge. I think that behavior but not belief converges to a common good value. I think that's the point. And the power of transformation is always done by the self. Those 2 points, right? I want to repeat that the behavior, but not the belief structure, converges to a common good value. And that the power of transformation is only within the self. You don't change someone. You provide a space where they change themselves. We all have a Yetzer Hara, tendency to the dark, and a Yetzer Hatov, a tendency to the good, to guide the dark in our thoughts, feelings, behavior. And we can only tolerate knowing about them to varying degrees. And all of us project our shadow, the negative stuff, onto others. That's a given, that we do this all the time. Every human being, us, them, we all do it. And it's not to a greater or lesser degree. We all do it to pretty much the same degree. The only answer to a racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, religiously intolerant speech is more speech, countering it, not just with facts, but with motives, context, history, timeline, recognizing others' despair, pain, suffering, and truth when they have true parts to what they're saying, without referencing your own. I want to sidetrack here. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. And when he conquered Egypt, in the great library of Alexandria, he got control of that, which was the greatest library in the civilized world at that time. Alexander the Great went to the Jewish community of Egypt, around Alexandria. He went to the Alexandrian Jews, and he offered to burn anti-Semitic texts, papyrus. They didn't have books, they had scrolls. So he offered to burn the anti-Semitic scrolls that were in the great library of Alexandria. And the Jewish community, through their rabbis, said, please don't do that. Please let them exist and be available, because their notion was the only answer to anti-Semitic speech is more speech. And it wasn't just throwing facts at people, it was explaining timelines. What do I mean by timelines? Okay, so that story's over. Timelines. One of the things I've learned of great value, since I only recently sort of got involved in social media, like TikTok and all, this is probably my second week of posting things, because it's my second week of scrolling and learning things, are the number of really well-informed people, historians in particular, and scholars, who increase my timeline about events, which changes my viewpoint. And for this, I've referenced this several times in some of the other videos I've made, that all of this current becoming familiar with social media comes from my 14-year-old grandson, who, when I told him of something that I had done, that I was on Facebook a lot, which, being 80, that was sort of my social media. I began getting all of these horrendous reels and pictures of, I like animals, and so starving dogs and dogs with tumors and abandoned animals and kittens that were painted, and just horrendous stuff. And I wanted to find a way to stop it. And so I Googled how to stop them, and it told me that you do the share thing, and then you'll get a choice and say not interested, and that will momentarily get rid of some of those reels. And I was telling him how I had been so successful because I had been avoiding going onto Facebook, which I liked because I see a lot of family and friends and their photos. And my 14-year-old says, "Oh yeah, Grandma, that's how you change the algorithm's perception of your interests. You know, it's measuring your clicks every 6 seconds or whatever it's doing, and if you click something that's opposite or other, or say you're not interested, it modifies its view of you." And I was astounded that the relationship between me and social media was the algorithm's perception of my interests in order to try and monetize something from me, and my ability to get in with that's its goal. And my goal was to get information and be curious, but have a balanced view of the things that I'm interested in, and that tension exists. Well, you know, just as I have this personal tension with the algorithms of social media and their perception of me, each one of us with our Yetzer Hara and Yetzer HaTov is trying to change the algorithm of others, of the people around us who disagree with us. It's a sort of an interesting way to view persuasion. And you don't necessarily do it only with facts, although facts help. But if that's all you do, you can see the resistance. Then you end up with people who don't listen because they take what you're saying to mean you think you're better than me, you're not being honest about what's really going on here, and you're a liar because what you're saying is not true. Because what I picked up from the Klein interview was Republicans were speaking their truth when they said we feel like the media is biased against us and they're shoving their values down our throat, and the system isn't working for us, and so it must be something going on. We probably need to put those values aside for something else that will work for us better. It's not that they've not got those values. They put them aside, just the way evangelicals aren't suddenly immoral with no values. They can't think of any other way that they get the system to do something they want, i.e. allow the, quote, unborn to exist, than to sign on for someone like Donald Trump and the Project 2025 people. And we need to put the conversation back in its proper place. So this conversation between Coates and Klein made me realize that I have difficulty thinking about my own heroes. Yeah, what about flawed heroes? Like the Founding Fathers. This has become a very interesting topic of conversation. The Founding Fathers had an idea of dignity and freedom for all propertied white men, right? Dignity, freedom, pursuit of happiness for all propertied white men. And they were slave owners, many of them, and they exploited the labor of others, and they used that unpaid labor for themselves so they could come up with it. They had the time to come up with some interesting, great ideas. But they gave me, the value I hold of dignity, respect, and the pursuit of happiness for all humans, for all people. And the reality is, I didn't come out of the head of Zeus fully formed. I took ideas from other people and I expanded them. And they've sometimes been incorporated in my Yetzer HaTov, my tendency towards the good. People like Eleanor Roosevelt, who talked about at the UN, maybe we need a universal Bill of Rights for every human being on the globe. She and Celine, the poet, and the two of them were laughed out of conference, but it's an idea whose time has come. So it's a bait, how do I think about these heroes, these flawed people who gave me something so valuable for myself? I haven't come to a conclusion yet, other than to say maybe they don't deserve the word hero or the amount of respect I gave them before, but I need to give credit to their influence on me and how they made me have a better Yetzer HaTov. I haven't figured out how to do that yet, but that's something the debate brought up in me. And the other is that the current debate, we need, when Klein said it was about journalists and Coate said, not really, maybe it's about something else. I disagree with what they both think it's about. Because I don't think this is a debate between Democrats and Republicans, nor do I think it's a debate between Democrats and MAGA, nor is it even a debate about the Yetzer HaTov, the values that all groups hold towards other. I think it's a debate about whether we're going to be in a constitutional republic run by ordinary people for the greater good versus a constitutional republic run by corporate America for the greatest corporate profit that may or may not trickle down. That's the real conflict of issues. And somehow we have to figure out how to bring that debate into the conversation instead of blaming others for voicing the shadow stuff of ourselves. I'm not sure I'm the person to say how to do that. But I think people who believe in a form of expanded Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which are the American versions of socialism, know what they're talking about. They represent one side of this. And the problem with calling people social democrats is that socialism can be discussed as if it's communism, which is really othering. And it makes us think, oh my God, it's Russian communism. By the way, you really need to increase the timeline. When you increase the timeline, you get to understand the algorithms' effect on certain peoples. This is not just us against Putin and a KGB officer's attempt to conquer the world and defeat America and democracy. It comes out of World War II when 24 million to 27 million Russians were deliberately destroyed by Germany. Russia suffered the greatest number of casualties of any country in World War II for those that were involved in World War II. And I'm sure as part of that timeline, when the survivors of that horrendous debacle said never again, just as Jews with their deaths of 6 million said never again, or the Romani who suffered even greater losses percentage-wise thought never again. If you go back to that timeline, it tends to explain people's behavior in terms of their defensiveness or aggressiveness, but that's another whole story. I do think that the task for us today is to find some way within ourselves to stop projecting other onto others, our shadow, our negativity, our dark side onto them, and say, you hold it for me and I'm the good here. And talk about what the real conflict is. That I think a constitutional republic should be run by the greatest number of people for the greatest good, with a Bill of Rights protection of minorities, because even then, greater good isn't always the best answer, versus corporate America, which has incredible power, basically getting it recognized that they should be in control and they should run everything, and stop talking about democracy. Because I think that's the real debate. I think that's what Peter Thiel is saying, that the ordinary person is surplus population. And you know what? He'll take care of them to the point that they'll buy things. But the real thing is corporations and what's good for corporations. And using that population to maximize corporate profits, and hoping that some of it trickles down so that they get basic survival. I think that's what the debate is about. And to whatever extent you can weave that into a conversation, listening to the other, acknowledging when you're wrong and that you might have hurt someone, and apologizing for that, and seeing a point that they might have, which means you have to find points that are true, which means you have to look and see where your dark side has been and where they are right. I was a Biden Democrat. I thought he was wonderful. I thought Kamala Harris was doing great things. And then, look where we are now, because maybe there were some things that weren't so good. What are they saying that might be true? Not their behavior, but what are they saying is the pain that they're reacting to? We might have a better chance of convincing them of what the real discussion is about and where they might want to weigh in on our side. I'm not sure if we can change the name to Social Democrats and win without losing the term socialism. I'm open on that, but that's what I wanted to say, was sparked in me by this wonderful podcast, and I have no idea. By the way, as another issue, I just sort of put these videos up. I don't have a name on them other than my own, and I notice other people sort of have a name. And so I was thinking, what would I want for a name? And I've been thinking about it, and at the moment, I kept thinking about Will Smith in Men in Black. And every time Tommy Lee Jones won't listen to him, and when he has a valid point, finally, in desperation, after repeating himself, he goes, "Old guy," and gets Tommy Lee Jones' attention, the character, his attention in the movie. So I'm not old guy. I'm 80, but I'm not a guy. I'm a woman. But old woman, it's either old woman or old gal. I haven't thought about it, but I'm thinking that might be a good moniker, a good handle for me, because now that I'm retired and older, this is going to be a perfect way for me to make videos, to put bits and pieces of thoughts I have onto the internet. If the grandmother hypothesis is correct, and that's where civilization comes through, is when grandmas tell you what they've learned over their 80 years. Yeah, but I haven't thought of a handle yet. But that's my thought basis. Anyway,